Managing Violence Podcast, Season 4, Episode 7, with Paul Sharp. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of the Managing Violence Podcast. I hope you're well wherever you are in this crazy, crazy world. I know things are turning upside down at the moment, but thank you for making the time to join us here on the Managing Violence Podcast. Just a reminder that if you are in self-isolation or quarantine at the moment, that we're available on pretty much every platform and on YouTube. So if you'd like to catch up on the Managing Violence Podcast, well, it's a pretty good time to do so. Today I'm joined by Paul Sharp, who is a career law enforcement officer as well as an OG of the BJJ Straight Blast Gym community. Paul has a long law enforcement career, including general duties, SWAT teams, undercover in drug and gang squads. And we talk a little bit about that, as well as the evolution of police defensive tactics, which he's been privy to a lot of. And it's a really good conversation around the practicalities of self-defense and managing violence from a law enforcement point of view. Before we get into Paul, I just need to give a big shout out to our new tribal elder, Matt Thornton. He is subscribed at patreon.com/managing violence, and therefore he gets a whole bunch of perks. Daz is also a great contributor to the Managing Violence Tribe, which is our Facebook group. Feel free to join that as well. Daz has a wealth of knowledge, and I will be getting him on the podcast probably for Season 5, because I'd love to pick his brain a bit further about some of the things I've seen him write. Thanks, Daz, for joining the Tribal Elders. And now, over to Paul Sharp. Paul Sharp, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us on the show, my friend. It's great to finally have this set up. I think I reached out to you, maybe over a year ago. We tried to set something up. Times didn't quite align, but we finally made it. So this is awesome.
Yeah, it is. Thank you.
So, Paul, for those that may not know much about you, can you set the scene a little bit? Tell us a little bit about who you are and what your journey has looked like.
Sure. So I'm Paul. I retired from law enforcement a few years ago. I did a little over 20 years. During that time, I worked as a resident officer, a neighborhood officer, worked patrol, of course, SWAT, worked undercover, and did some special enforcement stuff. And then I was always involved in the training aspects for the department, empty hands, counter knife, or edge weapons defense, impact weapons, pepper spray, and firearms. And then I spent some time as the lead pistol instructor there, kind of revamping the program a little bit. Not that it was terrible, but just times change and things change. And so we went from a modern technique-based shooting system to the more of the modified isosceles approach to shooting. So I was there and part of all that transition. So it was very educational and a great opportunity for me to be in on something like that. And then, so that was my professional career. And then after law enforcement, I still work part-time a little bit, just because it's kind of hard to not keep your toe in the water, so to speak. So I do work part-time at a friend's agency. And so I get to help out there whenever they need, coverage for shifts and things like that, or more specifically in training for those guys. And then I also, during this whole time, I was always I just stay busy. I try to stay really as busy as possible. I don't know why. I don't like to sleep, I guess. So I've always worked in some sort of security, close protection detail work, and I've always done that kind of stuff on the side. I've also always had a martial arts business on the side. And in 2001, I began training at a place called The Site, which is a training facility in Northern Illinois in the United States. I started training there, which is a glorified way of saying I started there basically stapling targets, painting steel, cutting grass, whatever they needed to do, kind of like an apprenticeship, I guess.
Yeah.
And at that time, I just was so, I considered it such a great honor and privilege to do the job and get paid for it, and to spend time around guys who I had read about in magazines or seen in books or things like that. And those guys were regular instructors. And I guess I don't like the word operator, but what would you call it? A guy who's actively in the field working, and those guys were all coming through there. And so that was an education in and of itself. So it was really cool to do that, up to the point now where I teach a couple of their flagship courses, pistol courses and home defense courses. And also anytime they have custom, like personalized training, that kind of thing come through, I get to be involved in that stuff. And then also I competed. I've always competed. I started competing when I was 8 in wrestling and boxing when I was 10. And so I've always wrestled and boxed. And then I began to explore other martial arts after school because there's really nowhere to go with wrestling, really, unless you want to be a professional wrestler, and I'm not big enough for that. So I had to, it's like, oh, I can't play the NBA. I'm too short. I can't play football. I'm too small. I can't, so it's like, all right, what am I going to do here? So, but I had to, basically I had that itch, like we all do. I wanted to keep training and I loved it. And so I explored a bunch of different martial arts. I became a full instructor in Jeet Kune Do concepts and Filipino martial arts. And I went through that process. I also was ranked in American Kempo, Ishinryu, Weishiru, and several other traditional, I guess you would call them traditional martial arts. And that gave me the opportunity to kickbox, which was fun, painful but fun, educational, definitely educational. Things are rapidly change when you have 4 things trying to punch you in the face instead of just 2 hands. And so that was interesting. And I think I grew through that process. I definitely lost some brain cells, but it's just part of it, I guess. So then when I became a police officer, after I'd already been an instructor, and I was introduced to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in the early 90s, 93, I believe was when Hickson Gracie did a seminar in South Florida, which is where I was living at the time. And it just kind of blew me away. And it also felt like wrestling again. So, and I really missed it. I didn't realize how much I missed wrestling. And so I was able to, through Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, kind of get back into that side of myself and just have some fun, and the physical exertion, the workout, the just laying there on the mat after a hard training session, just completely drained and wondering how you're going to be able to drive home. That feeling, I had not felt that in a long time. And so I missed it, which sounds strange, but it's true. So, we miss that exertion, right? And when we don't have it. And so I found a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu instructor through the Hickson Gracie seminar. There was one guy in South Florida at the time who was teaching, and I started training with him. And then when I received the call that I had been accepted for the job in Elgin, Illinois, which is way far away from Miami in every possible way, I moved up here, and yeah, right. And it's cold, and and so I moved up here, and I didn't even have a winter coat when I came up here. It's kind of funny. And so I took the job and began to work, and that kind of began to I'm not an overly religious guy. I don't want to insult anybody who is. I don't pretend to be. But there's a passage in the Bible that says a man's gifts will make room for themselves. And I look at things that have happened in my life, and the whole reason I got a training position and some other things that occurred for me in the police department was simply because of all the training I had done. And I didn't try to knock on any doors. I didn't even know it was possible to be a trainer in the police world or anything like that. I was so new to it. but a guy was kind of said to me, hey, when you're in the police academy, I heard that Joe Smith, the lead defensive tactics instructor and director of training down there, like to use you to demo everything on because you know all that stuff too. And I said, okay. I don't know if that's why he chose me, but yeah, I got chosen a lot. And he said, well, show me some of that stuff. So I did. And then next thing I know, he was inviting me. He was a team leader on the SWAT team. He went and talked to the SWAT commander. They invited me to a SWAT training day to show guys some of that stuff. And that kind of kicked the door open in the police world for me for training. And so so that's kind of my background, how I got started, and how from there to here, it's always been word of mouth, friends, people refer me, people tell other people to train with me or have me come in and train. And I've been very fortunate in that regard that I've never had to look for work, I guess, because I'm surrounded by some really awesome friends that just are like, hey, throw this guy a bone, So,
Those are the best stuff to get, man. There's the best stuff to get. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. And, it's a lot of pressure because you don't want to let them down because they referred you, So I think it's good for the client too, because you end up trying to do a 100% better job than you possibly even have to do because you want to, you don't want to let your friends down. So it's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. How did you get hooked up with Straight Blast Gym? When did that happen?
So that was in 98. So I had trained the Jeet Kune Do concepts and the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I was training with Paul Vunak's crew, Progressive Fighting Systems. And so Burt Richardson did an article. He had a column in a magazine. I believe it was called Inside Kung Fu. And Burt Richardson's, I can't remember what his column was called, but he talked about training with a guy named Matt Thornton and aliveness and all this stuff. And I'm reading this article and I'm thinking, man, this is kind of what we're already doing. Like it's just, we're missing some pieces as far as how to put it together, how to make it kind of flow from one range to the next without, because without sounding disrespectful, I'm only talking about my own journey. I would feel like, okay, well, I'm going to put my Thai shorts on and do my Thai boxing. And then I'm going to put my, my CLOT gear on, and I'm going to do my CLOT or my Kali training. And then I'm going to go change into this other outfit, my SWAT outfit, and I'm going to work my SWAT. And it always felt compartmentalized, if that makes sense. It always felt like I'm not really figuring out how to put it all together. And when I read this article, it sounded like Thornton had figured it out. Like he had figured out how to put it together. And so I sent him an email and he sent me back his phone number. And so I called him and we just started talking and immediately clicked. It was like, see, he was on the same journey as I was, except he was probably a year ahead. And he's also, I know you had him on your program how long ago was that?
Yeah, I had him on the start of season 3, so that would have been 6 months ago maybe.
Yeah. So you've talked to him. So he's a smart guy. He's a very
really smart guy. Really smart.
Yeah, very very thorough thinker. And so he started sharing with me that he had already put together aliveness, which was, everything we do has to have varying degrees of movement, timing, and resistance. And you can vary those 3 things, but you can never take one completely out of the picture, or otherwise it becomes just a static drill that really doesn't have a lot of benefit. And that's where my training was falling down up to that point. It was either drill or spar, and there was no in between. There was no progression.
Mm-hmm.
And so he had put that together, and then he had these other, he used triangles at that time. So he had these other triangles such as adaptability, which was, we want to be able to fight in the stand up, the clinch, of the ground. And he kind of condensed the fighting ranges down to those 3 as opposed to the 4 that I was used to training in. So that was kind of where that came from. So a friend of mine had him into his gym in Florida at that time, and he became affiliated with the Straight Blast Gym at that time. And then Adam and Rory Singer also became affiliated at the same time. We all were kind of, at that time, it was kind of a loose conglomeration of guys who were just on the same path, same mindset. And we just wanted to have a group of our people, so to speak, people we could bounce ideas off of, people we could share concepts and principles with, and this is what I'm working on, and and then we could test things and have an outside view, somebody else test what we're working on and say, hey, that works or that doesn't work, and just basically accountability as well. And so from there, I was unable to make it down to Luis Gutierrez is the guy that brought him into Florida. So I was unable to make it down to Luis's seminar with Matt the first time, where Matt and Adam and Rory all became affiliated with Matt and part of the gym. And so I was unable to make it because of work. So I said, hey, would you want to come to my gym and train with us here? So he came to my gym, trained with us. He did a seminar for us, 2-day seminar. And it was really good stuff, really aligned with what we were doing already. And of course, with some tweaks, he was way ahead of us as far as how he thought about things and the philosophy and all that. And so it's kind of the test process is he just basically had me fight everybody that was there. And yeah,
what a crazy idea to test the applicability of martial arts, actually having someone fight.
Yeah, right. And so we got after it, and then he said, hey, you're on the same page as me and the rest of the guys. You can handle yourself. Obviously, you just handled all these people at the seminar, because I had to go against everybody, basically one after another. It was an Iron Man type thing. I didn't realize that was kind of my instructor test, and to see if I could, hang with representing the gym. And especially you have to remember back at that time, the dojo invasion thing was still a real thing. Like
that was still a real concern.
Yeah, they'd show up at the gym and want to fight, and it's like, okay, man, well, let me turn the camera on first, sign this waiver, and I'll get the camera turned on, and then I'm going to beat you up, and it's going to be on video, and so that was the thing. So, and then, so then he invited me to become part of the gym, and that was it. So that was my intro and induction into the Straight Blast Gym, and I think at this point I'm kind of considered one of the OGs. One of the original. I was the third person outside of Portland to become an instructor and or affiliated with the gym. So that was 98, 99.
Wow.
I think, I got the certificates around here somewhere. I could probably look at them and see. But I want to say 98. And then and at that time, Matt did regional directors, because there were so many training groups popping up where people were like, hey, we're kind of on the same page. And keeping in mind the era back then, there wasn't a lot of people who were doing what we were doing at that time. So we had training groups kind of popping up everywhere. So it helped to have regional directors to kind of converse with the training groups and help them stay on track and help them develop what they were developing and doing. And so that was a really cool aspect of being part of the gym at that time, was helping guys who were trying to put it together, help them become their own entity, their own gym. So that was really a very satisfying part of my journey and involvement with the gym at that time.
That's awesome, man. So, I mean, given that resume, you're the perfect person to have on to discuss this topic that we sort of flagged before we started recording, which is defensive tactics for law enforcement and operational skills training, we'd call it here. And I'm just interested in your take. I mean, 20 years in law enforcement, you've obviously probably seen an evolution in terms of training and different approaches. From my limited experience in that world, I found that good training can be hard to come by, and it's largely due to risk of litigation, injuries in training, etc., and departments being a little bit risk adverse about the idea of having officers actually engage in anything that looks like combat because there's a risk of injury. So I'd just like to get your opinion, or I guess for your experience of what the training looked like when you first started and how it's moved ahead since then.
Yeah. So when I started, it was a lot of wrist locks and pressure points. And interestingly enough, that stuff still is pretty popular, still prevalent in a lot of areas. I became an instructor. I went through the instructor process for PPCT, which is pressure point control tactics.
Yeah, I did that one as well.
Yeah, yeah. Also, controlled force, which was a five holds, they called them.
Yep.
Were kind of based in wrestling, kind of not. And then there was another one, I think it was called the Claw, which was basically a series of Kimura type things.
Okay.
Which wasn't
I've
bad.
come across the Claw.
Yeah. No, I'm sorry, the Clamp.
Clamp, right.
Yeah. So we call it the Claw, kind of joking, but because remember there was that professional wrestler that had the claw thing. So
Von Erich Claw.
Yeah. So that was, they're not entirely bad, but they're not entirely good. And part of the problem is the training methodology. If you don't ever introduce aliveness into your training, you're never going to functionalize whatever it is you're doing. I did a series on wrist locks where I teach wrist locks out of hand fighting. So we're pummeling, we're hand fighting, and then we get wrist locks out of that. And the students in my gym have learned it that way. A lot of those guys are in law enforcement or security of some type, or they've had training, and they always comment, they wish they had learned wrist locks this way out of hand fighting, because they'd actually be able to use it, or would have been able to use it sooner. Because
that's so good. Sorry to cut you off there. I just want to say that it's such an important thing. I mean, a lot of people kind of, they denigrate things like wrist locks and pressure points and so on because they're not applicable to high-end life or death violence. But for someone working in law enforcement or security, not every situation is high-end life or death violence. Sometimes it is just dealing with passive resistance or someone who's intoxicated. Or, you need to have a lower-level force option, but it also needs to work.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way to know, right, is through the training. So it's kind of like, I think it was Kano that said the way is in training. And so it's always about the training. It's never really the technique as much as the training. And the training methods will round off those edges that are ineffective and non-functional. But with wrist locks, like you said, sometimes we have to, if you're on an ambulance assist call, so you have some medics and they're dealing with a person who's highly intoxicated, you can't just grab that guy and supplé him and, throw him into some sort of heel hook or whatever. That's just craziness, right? You have to be able to manage that person's body, move them through space. And so using wrist locks or maybe some pressure point type stuff, that it has an application in those circumstances. Sometimes, like you said, sometimes we might not even arrest somebody. Sometimes we might just need them to stay back or move out of the way. And like on a domestic, you have family members that are like, "Oh, don't arrest him. Let me take him. I'll talk to him." And it's like, well, it's not really. It's out of your hands now. So he's got to go. But I don't want to. I don't want to throw grandma or grandpa around or whoever it is that thinks they're going to talk to this guy. So, there has to be other ways to manipulate their body through space without creating damage. And I find those things to be applicable in those areas, and also what I found is I have a lot of people. I taught that series at the Straight Blast Gym Camp in Niagara quite a few years ago out of hand fighting. And since that time, I've had a number of guys tell me they've used it as bouncers or even just in social circumstances where somebody puts their hands on them and they don't want them to. And they just, a real quick, subtle wrist lock sends the message like, "Hey, don't touch me, it hurts." So
absolutely.
You know,
As you say, it comes back to aliveness. You know, you got to train it with some sort of movement and reality attached to it.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And having that element in there, having that ability to scale your response so that it's appropriate to whatever it is they're giving you, and then having the confidence that you know you can take it higher if you need to. Like, this isn't all I have. Don't only have a wrist lock or one of these things. It's, I can go further. You know, it's just I don't need to if that serves the purpose. So, yeah, man, I think that's within law enforcement. With the it's really the training methods, I think, that fall down, and a lot of that comes down to liability. Administrators are afraid of people getting hurt. They're afraid of lawsuits. They're afraid of, you know, the workman's comp. I don't know what they call it over there, but here
Yeah,
it's,
same
you know,
thing.
work comp. Yeah, yeah. So they're afraid of that. They're afraid of somebody being injured, and also it creates shortages, right, on the job. You know, if you have if your shift is 30 people and 5 of them go out on injury because of training, well, we've got a problem. You know, like
You have to
that's
risk
causing
manage that
issues.
training for sure. I mean, it's
Yeah,
yeah, I had
yeah,
a long-term career police officer here as a family friend, and when I was actually considering that as a career path when I was coming out of high school, and we're talking about it, and yeah, he was saying that the evolution of their quote-unquote defensive tactics. I mean, when he got in the '60s, it was pretty much a boxing club at the academy,
yeah,
and then there was some basic instruction, and then you kind of just had to fight for you had to fight a guy in a
yeah,
suit, and that was graduation. And
yeah,
but he's saying like now it's a little bit different because obviously we did have height and weight requirements and certain things that got abandoned. And
sure,
they said, now a recruit, if they get injured in training, they're still eligible for compensation, and you could have someone who you've just invested $100,000 in training, who's about ready to graduate, who now has a broken wrist and is now going to sit at home for another 2 years claiming full pay, and
yeah,
they've never actually been on the street.
oh yeah,
So it's
yeah,
a real thing. You've got to you've got to manage that risk, and I think it's something that it's a transition for those of us that were kind of old school instructors that are now operating in the modern world. We have to be aware of that. You can't be ignorant to that fact that you have to, you can't just tell everyone to suck it up. Like, you've got to have
yeah.
plans.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's really, and like you said, there was a height and weight requirement. There were all kinds of things, and those things are gone now. It's a different world. We can cry about it all we want. You know, we can kind of look at a lot of guys get nostalgic. You know, the good old days, and all you needed was your flashlight and something. You just you split everybody's head and kick them in the butt and send them home. And it's like, no, that's not how it works anymore. And I don't even know if it worked then, but
It wasn't recorded then.
yeah, that's the thing. That too. But yeah, there was a little bit of rowing at the academy when I went through. There was a boxing. We put on the boxing gloves and get after it. And that there's been a significant change over the years. I have manuals from the 50s and 60s, and even the 70s from various police departments. And they talk about boxing, and they talk about judo and wrestling and jiu-jitsu, and there's even one, it's called police jiu-jitsu. It's kind of interesting, and it's got a lot of strikes and kicks and throws and that kind of thing, and none of which would fly today.
No.
None of which you'd have to be in jeopardy. You'd have to be able to articulate that you were in great fear, or at least you felt like you were going to receive severe bodily injury in order to do a lot of that stuff. And so I really don't think that's ever going to happen. I don't think we're ever going to go back to those days where boxing is something that's going to happen at the police academy. I think it's too risk averse. And it just is the way it is. I mean, as much as I love boxing, I don't think it'll ever be part of modern policing again. But I do think arts like jiu-jitsu, judo, wrestling, any kind of alive grappling-based system will always have a place, because you're always going to have to move a body through space. You're always going to have to, whether it's just escorting somebody out of a building. Here we have what they call trespass complaints. So say a guy comes into a restaurant and he's arguing with the maitre d' or whomever, or even I've had one where a guy was arguing with the restaurant about his bill. He'd already paid, but he's still arguing. And the manager said, I just want him out of here. Just want him out of here. And so basically, you have to walk somebody like that out. You can't make a scene. You're in a public place, in a restaurant, a nice restaurant. I can't just slam this guy.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to grab his arm and twist it up behind his back either. So how do I move this guy through space? So basically a seatbelt. I basically get a 2-on-1 grip on one side. So on his left arm, I have my left arm hooked underneath of his bicep. And so we're facing the same direction. And I snaked my right arm around and caught his right arm and pinned it to his side. And we walked him out. And the whole time he had this look, he's looking at me with this weird look on his face, because he doesn't understand that he has no control. He's moving whether he wants to or not, but he's not in pain. He wasn't in pain, but that's something we do. I did it for 2 hours this morning in jiu-jitsu. I'm going to do it for 3 hours tonight in jiu-jitsu. It's where we move a body through space, and sometimes we hurt that body and sometimes we don't, so, it's just, it's all based on what's appropriate to the circumstance. And I think that's going to become more and more important in law enforcement, and the ability to articulate that is really going to become important, because it's always going to be about how you articulate what you did and how you explain what you did. But I think jiu-jitsu and grappling-based arts that have that aliveness component will become more and more important. I think they're going to become kind of the mainstays in law enforcement. I think across globally, I think it'll happen, because it's not just in Western countries where people are not comfortable with seeing the police beat up citizens.
Yeah. I'd be interested to get your thoughts as a jiu-jitsu black belt, and obviously with your training and work pedigree, about how jiu-jitsu needs to be modified to accommodate. These guys are, they're not on the streets in gis and bare feet. They're wearing boots. They've got plate carriers. They've got all sorts of gear and duty belts that are loaded up. How do you accommodate that with training to be able to still function and train jiu-jitsu?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things that people don't think about is the damage that your gear does to someone when you do just what would not be a damaging movement in a regular jiu-jitsu class. So say I transition from side control to north-south to side control on the other side, keeping my chest pinned, just like I would in jiu-jitsu. I'm going to pin that person down, right? Chest to chest, maximize that connection and move around them, keeping my weight on them to keep them pinned. Well, if you do that to somebody wearing a duty belt and a vest and all that stuff, when you stand up, their face is going to look like hamburger. Yeah. You will have, your gear will have chewed them alive. And that's things that you have to think about when you're doing these things. You can't just do what you normally would do. There have to make some tweaks. There has to be some modifications made. One of the things that I really liked was the knee ride position. I could put my knee on their side or on their stomach, keep them pinned down, move them over onto their stomach. If I needed to cuff them, move them onto their stomach, or just pin them in place and monitor their hands so that they can't access weapons or access my weapons. And then also from that position, I could look around and scan and keep an eye on the scene, make sure everything is secure while holding them in place. And then also the damage to that person is not as great. And a lot of guys will say, well, I don't care if I hurt them. I don't care if I hurt the bad guy or whatever it is. And I completely understand that sentiment. I've had bad guys try to kill me. I get it, so I get having no concern for their safety or that kind of thing. But at the same time, I also understand that if there's a possible way to make this person or get this person to be compliant without having to go there, why wouldn't I want to do that? And that's not to say, sorry. Oh my Lord. Yeah. That's my, it's a combination of a Labrador and a poodle.
All right, Labradoodle.
Yes. And she thinks she's 10 feet tall and bulletproof. She's
Nice.
gonna take on the world. But at least her barking would. Uh, but so from that perspective, um, again, anytime I talk about this stuff with guys in law enforcement, they kind of look at me like I'm soft or that kind of thing. But it's not that. It's not that I don't know how to turn it up when I need to. I don't know how to beat somebody into submission, for lack of a better term. It's not that at all. It's in law enforcement, I always have to give them the option to comply. So if I am grinding this person's face into hamburger and crushing the life out of them, yes, I'm dominating them physically and mentally, but I'm also making it so they feel like they don't have an option, so they're going to have to fight. And I don't want to push them into that zone. My defensive tactics instructor at the police academy used to tell guys all the time and caution people, listen, with pressure point tactics, listen, you dig your thumb into this guy's mandibular and you keep digging it even after he puts his hands behind his back, and you keep digging and you keep digging because you just want to hurt him. You're going to turn this guy big, green, and ugly. You're going to have the Incredible Hulk on your hands, even if it's only a 145-pound male. Once that adrenaline dump happens, you've got a whole other beast. And so, and that's the thing. If you make, and I've been the role player enough where I've had guys, you know what I mean? I've had I've worn the suit and I've been on the other side of it enough to know what he's talking about. There have been times where I just wanted to hurt people because no matter what I did, they wouldn't stop hurting me, twisting my arms behind my back. Yeah, they're like pulling on my head, twisting my neck. They're got my arm cranked way above my head. My other arm's cranked, 180 degrees the wrong direction. And all I'm thinking is I'm trying to comply. I'm trying to do what I was given as directions before the exercise, I'm trying to comply, but they are hurting me. So the second I can get my arm inside, I'm going to start hurting them, and then you have to, then you have to kind of talk yourself down like, okay, they're recruits. They don't know what they're doing. It's not intentional. Yeah. They just don't know what they're doing. But
and they're not managing their own adrenaline either.
Yeah, that's the thing. So having been on the other side of it, that caused me to really think about, okay, what ways can I best put a person in a position where they realize resistance is futile and they should just comply, but also I'm giving them opportunities to comply. They have ample opportunity to simply put their hands behind their back and stop. And we'll figure this out later. We'll sort this out in court. We'll sort this out wherever, but we're not going to have a knockdown drag out right here in the street any further. So that gave me a lot of time to think about that. So the modifications are based on that. So the knee ride, body locks, being able to lock their body down, pin an arm to their side so they can't access tools or weapons, access my tools or weapons, and pin them in a position where they are immobilized. So they're not in pain, but they're immobilized. They might be uncomfortable, but they're not. Nothing's getting broken. Nothing's getting torn out of place. And so that causes them to mentally submit, which is more important than physically submitting. So if I can get them to mentally realize they don't have an option, there's nowhere to go, and they're completely controlled, they're probably just going to put their hands behind their back and call it a day, Yeah. And so overwhelmingly, over the course of my career, once I figured that part out, overwhelmingly over the course of my career, that's how things went. I would have guys who started out as they're going to fight me and rapidly progressed to, okay, I'm done. Just put my hands behind my back and we're done, And so I maybe punched 2 people, in my entire time of doing law enforcement work, body shots, just to stop a guy from swinging on me. And then went to a body lock and took him down. And that was about it. I always used grappling. I always used positional control. And those were the tweaks I made. I don't know if that answers the question or not, but
Yeah, absolutely, man. It's interesting. I was just recently at a seminar, and there was a guy doing a segment on interviewing technique for his pitching at loss prevention officers, doing interviews of suspected thieves, and former U.S. law enforcement guy, and he was saying that the number one technique to get someone to admit to a crime is to make them think you already know they did it and you've got all the evidence, so that there's no hope for them, so they may as well admit to it. And I
Right.
immediately in my brain connected that with control and restraint training, because as soon as they feel like there's no point fighting back because
Mhm.
nothing works, and that I'm
Yeah.
gonna end up in cuffs anyway, I may as well make it more comfortable.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing, once they know mentally they're defeated, that's it. We're done. That's yeah, that's it. And that's a really good way of putting it. It's almost as if saying, like, physically I have an answer for everything you're about to do. I already know what you're about to do, so don't do it. And once they're in that, you put them into that box, they're smart enough to know, like, let's just take the easy way out. Just comply and live to fight another day.
Yeah, and for a good for a good portion of them, it's not the first time they've played this game either. So
No. Yeah, that's the other thing too. If they've been, I've had guys before. Um, we, so we had an outdoor festival. A big fight started, of course, because people can't just not be drunk at an outdoor festival. So, they started fighting, had some carrying on, and and there was one guy who he was resisting an officer, scrapping around a little bit. I grab the guy. I come up, I come running up to help the officer. I grab the guy, pull him over, and sit him down on his butt. So I just swept and did a leg sweep, swept him, dropped him on his butt, and I'm holding him down now. So I'm basically I've got his arms pinned behind his back, and I'm holding him in place. He looks at me and goes, "Oh, damn. Okay, I'm done." And I was like, you know, he's been around the block enough times to know that this is different. This is not the guy who's going to keep twisting his wrist while he's punching the guy in the face, which was what was happening. He realized things just changed. And so there's something to that. That if they've been around the block, they know. They know when an officer grabs them, he knows what's up. He has control. Versus a guy who grabs them who's tentative, doesn't immediately establish control, and they realize they've got some wiggle room. They might be able to make a play.
yeah, actually, I've got a similar story. I was working in a bar as a bouncer, and I was on my own, and three young guys came in that were all quite intoxicated, and thought they when I told them they couldn't come in, they took the quick numbers assessment and thought they had a good chance of convincing me otherwise. And as the first one advanced, I'm a judo guy by by training, and
Yeah.
I just hit him with a very, very simple dashi barai, so a very simple little foot sweep that put him down quickly, caught his sleeve on the way down, so he landed flat and he didn't hurt himself, and it just froze time, because that was not what the others were expecting, and it literally diffused the whole situation with no one getting hurt, because they were expecting me to punch somebody, and when the punches didn't flow, it kind of confused them a lot, and they didn't really know what they were dealing with anymore. So they left.
Right. Yeah, that's the thing. They're not prepared for that. They don't. They're expecting one thing, and then all of a sudden, you have complete control of their movement. That's a different kind of mind game. That messes with the people mentally.
Absolutely.
I just had a discussion with one of my guys last night. He's really good. He spent 5 or 6 years competing in Muay Thai, and he started training jiu-jitsu with us about a year ago. And he's athletic, and he's also had trained previously in Muay Thai, so he kind of knew how to buckle down and work. And he said, he goes, the first week I came in here, I felt like I couldn't move. I felt like I'm in a different world. This is strange. I always thought I would just punch you guys in the face or kick you, but I ended up flat on my back and I can't move. Like, you threw me and were on top of me and I couldn't move. And it just was at once suffocating and motivating, because he realized there's a whole other world he needs to learn about. But that was the thing that he said, was just, he had no idea what it was like to have a good grappler get a hold of him and hold him down. Like, he never thought that was possible. He always thought, I'll just punch him or kick him or whatever. And, which is kind of funny if you think about it, because even in boxing, clinch happens. Even in kickboxing, clinch happens. And when the clinch happens, that's where all the throws and all that stuff is going to happen, right? So, but he talked about that it was just one of those moments where he realized this is a whole other world that I never knew existed. And that's probably what went through those guys' mind, right? When you threw that guy, was all of a sudden my friend's on his back and can't do anything. Now what?
Looks like
yeah. It's a totally different world. It's a totally it's control is what it is. It is establishing dominance and control immediately before it gets worse. And so they know right away, we're done. Like, this is only going to get worse. Will only.
The willingness to fight has passed.
Right. Like, things are only going to get worse now. So stop.
I'd like to get your thoughts. Something that I've been intrigued by, given your work history, having worked in what we'd call general duties, or being a beat cop, as well as doing undercover and doing SWAT. How do you feel about the differences in training or defensive tactics that are required for those roles? I imagine that, obviously SWAT, by the time SWAT's being called, someone's going away. But undercover would have its own challenges as well, in terms of the kind of conflict you're likely to find yourself in, and probably not wanting to look like you're too trained.
Yeah. So with the beat stuff, the general duties, that's more of just, you're putting your hands on people multiple times every shift that you work. You're, whether it's helping the medics, helping an ambulance crew with somebody who's mentally unstable, or you're helping, escort somebody out of a building, or somebody has to be arrested. You're taking somebody into custody. You're going to put your hands on people multiple times. What I found was that I would run the gamut almost every shift, between kind of the Wally J, small circle jiu-jitsu type stuff, all the way up to, my best version of Olympic level judo, where I would throw somebody and then control them once they hit the ground. And so in the beat areas, the general duties area, you really needed to be a well-rounded grappler, and to some degree well-rounded verbally. You had to have the abilities to ask, tell, make. You had to have the ability to talk people into it, rather than fight everybody into it. So you wanted to be able to talk people into compliance. In the undercover world, verbal agility was extremely important, because you just did not want to. Sometimes if you're wearing a wire or something like that, you definitely don't want to get into a physical situation where your shirt might get ripped off, or or you're outnumbered. There's 4 or 5 of them. You're by yourself. You don't want to get into it in a situation where they're going to beat you and leave you. And it might be a little while before anybody realizes you're not around. So, your verbal skills were your primary fighting tool. Was the ability to talk and convince them that they had as much to lose as you do if this went violent, if this went physical. Like, this is just business. Let's just do this. I don't need any other drama or any other issues. When it was time to actually get into it, so there was a couple times where I did get into it physically with people while working undercover. It was in vehicles. People would try to jump in the car and rob you, jump in the seat behind you. Like, a guy sits in the seat next to you, and then a guy gets in the seat behind you, and that guy's the guy that's going to try to rob you. And so those situations where, again, it's verbal until you can find a way to go physical, if you need to go physical to protect yourself. And in the vehicles, it was a lot of the vehicle-based fighting stuff is based on basically getting your back against something stable and stomping them. So you would brace yourself against the door and drive your foot into them and smash them against the other door. or shove them into the floorboard if you could, just kind of stomp them into the floorboard. That was the most effective stuff. Chokes work really well inside a car. Being able to climb onto somebody's back, and it's a tight space in there, but having the ability to not, it really forces you to look at jujitsu. And I coach jujitsu to my people. I've always coached jujitsu as a 360-degree zero gravity art or sport. So it's like, listen, I don't care where we are, because the difference between guard and mount is just our relationship to the earth. So I just want to always have that perspective that no matter where I'm at, I'm always on attack. I'm always on the offensive, looking for ways to hunt a submission. So in a car, it's even more so, because in a car, I could be on your back. You could be, say, on your hands and knees on the seat. I could be on your back, hooks in, about to sink a choke, and you stand up and push me against the roof of the car. That's going to be really uncomfortable on me.
Yeah.
Even though I have a choke, even though I have what seems to be dominant position, you slamming me into the roof of the car repeatedly is going to cause me to have to move. So, or my ribs are going to start moving. So that kind of thing was an interesting experience. That was an interesting perspective to have to get, because after my first incident, we sat down and talked and said, hey man, we've never really trained in a car like that. Like, we've trained shooting scenarios, we've trained all that, but we've never trained a fight in a car, just a full-on dog fight inside a car. So we started doing it. This was around 2003 or 4. We started getting cars in our undercover, in the area where we were for our home base for undercover stuff. We had a garage. We pull the car in there and get after it. We'd get inside the car and just, let's figure this out, man. Let's just do this.
Not much room for a red man suit inside a car.
No, man, it was none. So we'd be bruised up and banged up, which kind of helps with that area, with that assignment, because you look like you're, spending a lot of time on the street when you're walking around all banged up. But so that was kind of the focus there, was more of that confined space, like being jumped in a stairwell or in an elevator, that kind of thing. That was our focus with that stuff. With SWAT, a lot of the SWAT stuff is team, working with 3 or 4 guys to take somebody down, to control somebody, while other guys are monitoring their sectors and holding control of the room or the hall or whatever it is that you're doing. So, and also using shields and things like that. So with the SWAT stuff, it was more team tactics, but still jiu-jitsu based type stuff, where you're looking to control the body in the most efficient way possible. So you would look to control the hips, control the shoulders, that kind of thing, and then work to get their arms behind their back efficiently, because zip ties are easy to carry. Like you can carry 10 zip ties per guy for cuffing people, but they're cumbersome compared to just regular handcuffs. So that was the other thing too, was, the cuffing procedures using zip ties is a little different when you're wrapping people up in that regard, mostly because of the cumbersome nature, and then also because you have all your gear. So you have a rifle and a pistol, and you have flashbangs and all this other stuff hanging off of you. So you want to make sure that when you are taking people into custody, or you are controlling people for whatever reason, that you're doing so in a way that doesn't endanger the other team members. Because while a guy might have a breaching shotgun attached to his vest that he's not conscious of, because his pistol's in a holster and his rifle's slung, the bad guy sees that breaching shotgun and thinks there's an opportunity. So if he can grab that, he can make something happen with that. So all these different, so weapon retention was high on the list of things, which makes it even more important in that environment to do everything as a team and coordinated, so that you are conscious of the risk, the various weapons and tools that are hanging off of you everywhere, especially when it's a new SWAT guy. A new SWAT guy is like a gear sale, man. Holy cow. They take 2 of everything, and then after you're on the team for a while, you're like, man, this stuff's heavy. and I don't even use a lot of it. And, if we're doing stuff around a car, we're doing stuff in a bus or a train or whatever it might be, there's an old saying, run light to the fight. So if you can pare everything down to as streamlined as possible, it's even better. But still, there's that risk, right? Guys, I remember seeing a guy, rolling around with the dude and dealing with this guy. And I remember watching the bad guy grabbing ankles. And I didn't know. I was like, why is he grabbing that guy's ankle? He was looking for an ankle gun, so he was trying to see if one of the officers had a gun in an ankle holster.
Right.
So, that really made me begin to think, like, yeah, we learn to retain the pistol, or we learn to retain, the primary weapons, but what about all the other stuff we're carrying? And guys have knives on them and all that stuff. So everything on your person, you have to retain.
Absolutely.
You have to, right? You have to train for that. So that became part of our training as well, was constantly looking at, okay, are we moving with team cuffing and team detention and that kind of thing? Are we moving in a way that keeps us all safe, keeps anything bad from? So, that's kind of the main differences in the defensive, or whatever you want to call it, the physical tactics aspects for those different assignments.
Yeah, that's really insightful, man. I appreciate that. That's it's a question I've been thinking about for a while, and it's unusual to have a guest who's done all of them that can actually answer that question. The last thing I'd really like to talk to you about, or get your insight into, even though I'm based in Australia, around about 50% of the listeners, according to my stats anyway, are based in the US, and a question that comes up regularly in multiple forums that I come across is the role of training to use firearms in self-defense. And I mean, obviously, from our conversation so far, I know you're big on integrating different ranges of combat. What role do you think, or how much time should people be spending training with their firearms, and how do you integrate that into an overall combative curriculum?
Yeah, so I think about it kind of like in quadrants. So I think about business, recovery, our empty hands training, and then weapons training. So I think about it as a kind of four pieces, and then where they meet in the middle is how we integrate it all, how we bring it all together. And I think if someone were to devote a quarter of their training time to the firearms and even the edge weapons, I think that would adequately cover their bases for defensive firearms. So now that's not going to prepare them to be a sport shooter. Like, that's not going to prepare them to be competitive type shooter. You know what I mean? But, but that would prepare them for what they need to face. So let's say we take it down to like a microcosm of that. So a 20-minute training session could be 5 minutes of, say, shadow boxing, a 5 minutes, like the Canadian, what was it called? 5BX or whatever it was. So the Canadian military, way back in like the 70s or 80s, they had this physical fitness program, which was 5 body weight exercises for 1 minute each. So push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups, squats, and jumping jacks or something, for instance, 1 minute each. So that's 5 minutes of your physical fitness training. And then you had your 5 minutes of your work, and then say 5 minutes of some sort of edge weapon work or impact weapon work. You combine the two. And then 5 minutes of dry fire practice, or moving around, say, a car, moving around your house. Just 5 minutes of searching your house top to bottom. Say you're clearing for an intruder or something like that. If you were to do that every day, just that 20-minute routine, if you did that every day for a month, that would be 30 or 31 days consistently where you devoted what seems like a small amount of time, but a little bit adds up over time, especially when it's consistent. When you put that together over a month, you've probably done more than the person who does, say, 30 minutes of dry fire on a Monday and then doesn't do it again until 3 weeks later.
Yeah, I love that. That's actually that's really cool. Very, very practical for people that are time poor but want to stay sharp with their skills.
Yeah, so that's the thing. That's how I always look at it. Now you can always expand that out. You could always say, all right, well, today I'm going to do 15 minutes of each quadrant. So 15 minutes of whatever for each thing, or even more if you wanted, or you could do it twice a day, whatever you want to do. But the thing is that it has to be consistent. It has to be something that you're doing every day. And Chad Lyman is what is the name of his company? C4C, I think, is the name of his company. Anyway, he's an old friend of mine. And Chad has a thing, he calls it a little, a lot. So do a little bit, a lot. So do a little bit of something every day, and you will have greater results than if you, because so often, I don't know if you're the same as me, but so often I fight this battle of, well, if I can't do an hour workout, then why am I even going to bother? So, yeah, right. So like if I can't do, my 2-hour routine, then this 5 minutes isn't worth it. But actually it is. So that's the thing, because it's consistency. The brain is going to run to the most recent and relevant, realistic training that we've done. The brain is going to look at what have we done most recently. And so if I've been training every day a little bit consistently over time, then I'm actually going to be better prepared to deal with whatever it is I'm facing than if I'm one of those guys who thinks, well, if I can't train for an hour, I'm just not going to train at all. So they end up only training once a week or once every couple weeks, if that. And so that quickly degrades into nothing at all.
Absolutely. So, I think there's a really cool benefit too of just remyelinating that neural pathway so that you're not getting sloppy. Even if you're not getting a lot of extra reps, you may not be improving greatly, but at least you're slowing down the degradation of the skill. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a constant battle, right? We never sit still.
We're
moving forward or moving back. But
unfortunately, all this stuff we dedicate our lives to are highly perishable.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
We get to keep it, unfortunately. All right, Paul. That brings us up on time for the regular part of the interview. We'll head over to Patreon to get bonus content in a minute. But for people that are leaving us here, if they want to know more about you, if they want to train with you or book you for something, whereabouts can they go to learn more?
So I'm easy to find on social media. That's probably the best place to find me. Paul Sharp on Facebook, and Paul_Sharp_SBG on Instagram. And then the Straight Bliss Gym Illinois is the Facebook account for the gym, for the business. And they can find me through there. I try to respond to everyone that messages me as best I can, as quickly as I can. And those are the easiest ways to reach me.
Yeah, awesome. And just want to quickly plug, you've got a BJJ instructional coming out. You just finished shooting, is that right?
Yeah, we just did a thing with BJJ Fanatics. It's an overview. So the first one is an overview of what's coming. So it's an overview of verbal skills, empty hand skills from wrist locks all the way up to taking the back, throws, all that good stuff. Also dealing with being held at gunpoint and dealing with an edge weapon. So, and multiple opponents a little bit. We didn't get too far into multiple opponents yet, but that's coming. And then, so that's kind of the first one that's coming out. And then I'm going back there in March to film the deep dive into each aspect of that. So we're going to go deep into wrist locks for everyday use, body, all that good stuff, everything I teach. So everything from harsh words to hand grenades or handguns. How to deal with all that. So we're going to cover all that in a series. So I'm stoked, man. It's really cool. BJJ Fanatics is a good company. Lots of excellent products they put out. So it's an honor to be included in that and be able to cover what I like to do, which is apply jiu-jitsu to self-defense.
That's awesome, man. And I'm really interested in that. It's been a while since I've been excited about a BJJ instructional, but for the sake of covering all that kind of material, which doesn't usually get touched on from a jiu-jitsu perspective, I'm pretty keen to get my hands on that when it comes out.
Yeah, very cool.
Cool.
Thank you.
All right, Paul. Thank you very much for your time, my friend. As I said, we'll head over to Patreon for the bonus questions, but thanks very much for making the time.
Yeah, thank you very much, man. It was an honor.
Thank you once again to Paul Sharp for sharing his knowledge and expertise. It was a really fun conversation, and I really enjoyed talking to Paul. And Paul's actually very generous with the bonus questions as well for our Patreon subscribers. Head over to www.patreon.com/managingviolence. There's about 24 minutes, give or take, of bonus content from Mr. Paul Sharp answering the Magnificent 7 bonus questions. Thank you once again to our loyal listeners. I hope you're keeping well, whatever you are doing at the moment, and I'll talk to you again next time.